I've noticed something over the years in practice that doesn't always get talked about in formal assessments or screening questionnaires. When I sit with someone in their 70s or early 80s and they start telling me about something that happened last week, they don't just give me the facts, they give me the context. They remember not just that their grandson visited, but that he came on Thursday afternoon right after the rain stopped, and that he mentioned something about his job that connected back to a conversation from a month earlier. They weave it together. It's not perfect. Sometimes a name slips away for a moment, or a date gets fuzzy. But the story has architecture. It has layers. And when I see that kind of recall, contextual, connected, layered, it tells me something about how their brain is managing information. It's not just about memory in the narrow sense. It's about integration, the ability to hold multiple threads and see how they relate. That's a kind of cognitive resilience that doesn't always show up on a standard memory test, but it matters. A lot. And then there's something else I notice. People who are aging well cognitively tend to track sequences without much visible effort. They can tell you what happened first, second, third in a story or a day. They don't lose the order. If they're describing a recipe or a repair they did or a conversation that unfolded over several minutes, the sequence holds. That might sound basic, but it's not. Sequence tracking relies on the brain's ability to organize time and causality. It requires the frontal lobes and the hippocampus to work together smoothly. When that system starts to falter, people often lose the thread. They might remember the events, but not the order. Or they start a story in the middle and can't quite anchor it. The ones who still hold sequence well into their 70s and 80s are showing me that their neural networks are still coordinating across regions. That's not something you can fake. It either works or it doesn't. Now, I want to be clear about something right away. I'm not here to tell you that if you can do these 5 things, you're guaranteed to avoid dementia or that you've unlocked some secret to perfect brain health. We don't have that kind of certainty. The science on cognitive aging is still incomplete. We know some patterns, we know some risk factors, but we also know that people surprise us. I've seen patients with impeccable recall who later developed cognitive decline, and I've seen people with mild forgetfulness who stayed sharp for decades. The brain is not a simple machine. It's adaptive, redundant, and shaped by so many variables: genetics, vascular health, inflammation, stress history, sleep quality, social engagement, and factors we probably haven't even identified yet. So what I'm offering here is not a guarantee. It's a framework. A way to think about what healthy cognitive aging often looks like and what might support it. That's all we can responsibly say. If you find any of this useful, or if it changes the way you think about your own brain health, I'd appreciate it if you tap the like button. It helps me know this kind of reflective conversation is worth continuing. And if you want more of these discussions, consider subscribing. No pressure, just an option. Let's talk about the third thing I notice: pattern recognition. This one is subtle, but it's powerful. People whose brains are aging well tend to recognize patterns in their daily lives without needing to consciously analyze them. They notice when someone's behavior shifts slightly. They pick up on recurring problems, like a drawer that sticks every time the humidity rises, or a friend who always cancels plans when a certain topic comes up. They see the pattern before it's obvious. That's not intuition in some mystical sense. It's the brain's ability to process repeated information, extract regularities, and predict what's likely to happen next. This ability depends on intact connections between sensory processing areas, memory systems, and the prefrontal cortex. When those connections weaken, pattern recognition fades. People start missing cues. They don't connect the dots as quickly. The ones who still do this well into older age are showing me that their associative networks are still firing cleanly. But here's where it gets more complicated. And this is something I think we underestimate in how we talk about brain health. A lot of what we attribute to cognitive decline is actually amplified by stress, by poor sleep, by chronic pain, by loneliness, by the body's baseline level of activation. If your nervous system is running hot all the time, if you're in a state of low-grade fight or flight because of unresolved anxiety, or because of inflammation, or because of disrupted circadian rhythms, your cognitive performance will suffer. Not because your brain is structurally damaged, but because the system is overwhelmed. It's like trying to have a conversation in a loud room. The words are there, the meaning is there, but the signal gets lost in the noise. I see this all the time. Someone comes in worried about their memory. They're forgetting names, losing track of conversations, feeling foggy. We do some screening. Structurally, the brain looks okay. No major atrophy, no obvious vascular events. But when I ask about sleep, they're getting 4 or 5 broken hours a night. When I ask about stress, they're dealing with chronic worry about a sick spouse or financial strain. When I ask about pain, they've had lower back pain for 2 years and it wakes them up every night. When I ask about social contact, they've been isolated since the pandemic and never quite reconnected. All of that creates noise. It floods the system. And the brain, which is already working harder to maintain function as we age, can't keep up. So when we talk about cognitive aging, we have to talk about the whole system. Not just the brain in isolation, but the brain in context. The brain in a body that's either supporting it or undermining it. The brain in a nervous system that's either calm enough to process information efficiently or so activated that everything feels harder than it should. Let me give you a metaphor that might help. Think of cognitive function like traffic flow in a city. When the roads are clear, the signals are timed well, and there aren't too many cars. Traffic moves smoothly. You get from point A to point B without much delay. But if there's construction, if several lanes are closed, if there's an accident, if everyone's trying to merge at once, everything slows down. It's not that the roads themselves have disappeared. It's that the system is overloaded. The capacity is still there, but the flow is disrupted. That's what happens in the brain when the nervous system is chronically activated. The neural pathways are still there. The neurons are still firing, but the flow is disrupted by inflammation, by stress hormones, by poor sleep, by pain signals, by emotional overwhelm. And that disruption looks a lot like cognitive decline, even when it's not. This is why I've started paying more attention to what calms the system down before I focus on specific cognitive exercises or supplements. If someone's nervous system is stuck in high alert, no amount of crossword puzzles or omega-3 fatty acids is going to make a meaningful difference. You have to address the bottleneck first. You have to clear the lanes before you can speed up the traffic. Let's talk about the fourth thing I notice in people who are aging well cognitively. Emotional regulation. This one surprises people sometimes because we don't usually think of emotional control as a cognitive skill. But it is. The ability to notice a strong emotion, pause, and choose how to respond. That requires the prefrontal cortex to inhibit the amygdala. It requires the brain to override an automatic reaction and substitute a more measured one. That's executive function. It's the same neural machinery that helps you plan, organize, and solve problems. When that system is working well, people can feel anger or frustration or sadness without being hijacked by it. They can sit with discomfort without spiraling. They can tolerate uncertainty without panicking. That's not about being stoic or emotionally numb. It's about having enough cognitive flexibility to manage internal states. And here's the thing, emotional regulation gets harder as we age, but not for the reasons people assume. It's not that older adults are inherently more emotionally volatile. In fact, some research suggests that emotional regulation can actually improve with age as people gain perspective and let go of things that used to bother them. But if the brain's regulatory systems are weakened by vascular disease, by inflammation, by chronic stress, by poor sleep, then emotional regulation falters. People become more reactive, they snap more easily, they ruminate more, they get stuck in negative loops. And that, in turn, creates more stress, which further disrupts cognitive function. It's a vicious cycle. So when I see someone in their 70s or 80s who can still pause before reacting, who can tolerate frustration without falling apart, who can sit with ambiguity without needing immediate resolution, I'm seeing intact prefrontal function. I'm seeing a brain that's still managing complexity. And that's a good sign. The fifth thing I notice is flexible thinking. The ability to shift perspective, to consider multiple possibilities, to change course when something isn't working. This is different from just being open-minded in a general sense. It's a specific cognitive skill. It's called cognitive flexibility, and it depends on the brain's ability to disengage from one mental set and engage with another. People who maintain this ability into older age can adapt to new information without getting stuck. They can revise their plans when circumstances change. They can entertain ideas that conflict with their initial assumptions. They don't dig in rigidly when challenged. That's not about personality. It's about neural plasticity. It's about the brain's ability to rewire itself, to form new associations, to let go of old patterns when they're no longer useful. And this is where the traffic metaphor comes back. Cognitive flexibility is like being able to take a detour when your usual route is blocked. If the brain is too rigid, too locked into habitual pathways, it can't adapt. It keeps trying to go the same way even when the road is closed. But if the brain is still plastic, still capable of forming new connections, it can reroute. It can find another way. That's what we want to preserve as we age. Now, let's talk about what we actually know and what we don't know about maintaining these abilities. The honest answer is that we have some clues, but not a complete map. We know that cardiovascular health matters. We know that blood flow to the brain is essential, and that anything that damages blood vessels, hypertension, diabetes, smoking, chronic inflammation, increases the risk of cognitive decline. We know that sleep matters because that's when the brain clears metabolic waste and consolidates memories. We know that social engagement matters because isolation is a strong risk factor for dementia. We know that physical activity matters because it promotes neurogenesis and reduces inflammation. We know that managing chronic stress matters because cortisol in high sustained levels is neurotoxic. But we also know that none of these things are guarantees. You can do everything right and still develop dementia. You can do very little and stay sharp. The brain is influenced by genetics, by early life experiences, by exposures we don't fully understand. So what I'm offering here is not a prescription for certainty. It's a set of practices that shift the odds in your favor. That's all we can do. We can't eliminate risk, but we can reduce it. We can't guarantee outcomes, but we can create conditions that support resilience. Let me walk you through a two-step approach that I think makes sense, especially if you're noticing that your thinking feels slower or foggier than it used to. The first step is not cognitive. It's physiological. You have to downshift the nervous system. You have to reduce the baseline level of activation so that the brain has the bandwidth to function well. That means addressing sleep first. If you're not getting 7 hours of reasonably uninterrupted sleep most nights, nothing else is going to work as well as it should. Sleep is non-negotiable. If you have untreated sleep apnea, get it treated. If you have insomnia, work with someone who understands cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, not just pills. If pain is waking you up, address the pain. Don't let it become background noise. The second part of downshifting is managing chronic stress. And I don't mean eliminating stress because that's not realistic. I mean creating regular moments where the nervous system shifts out of fight or flight and into rest and digest. That could be through slow breathing exercises. It could be through gentle movement like walking or stretching. It could be through spending time in nature. It could be through connection with people you trust. The specific method matters less than the consistency. You need daily practices that signal to your body that it's safe, that it can relax, that it doesn't need to be on high alert all the time. The third part of downshifting is reducing inflammation. This is harder to measure and harder to control, but it matters. Chronic low-grade inflammation disrupts brain function. It interferes with neurotransmitter production. It damages blood vessels. It accelerates aging. Some of this is genetic, and some of it is environmental. You can't control all of it, but you can influence some of it. Eating more whole foods and fewer processed foods helps. Managing blood sugar helps. Staying physically active helps. Treating chronic infections or autoimmune conditions helps. It's not about perfection. It's about reducing the total inflammatory load so the brain has less to contend with. Once you've addressed the physiological noise, once you've cleared the lanes, to go back to the traffic metaphor, then you can think about the mechanical tweaks, the cognitive practices that might support brain health. And here's where I want to be cautious, because the evidence is mixed. We know that staying mentally engaged is associated with better cognitive outcomes. But we don't know if that's causal. It might be that people who stay mentally engaged have healthier brains to begin with, and that's why they can stay engaged. Or it might be that mental engagement itself builds cognitive reserve. Probably both are true to some extent. What seems to matter most is novelty and challenge. Doing the same crossword puzzle every day probably doesn't do much, because your brain gets efficient at it. It stops being a challenge. But learning a new language, learning a musical instrument, learning a new skill that requires sustained attention and problem solving, that seems to build new connections, that seems to promote plasticity. It doesn't have to be formal or expensive. It just has to be genuinely new and genuinely difficult. Something that makes your brain work in ways it's not used to working. Social engagement also seems to matter, and this is where the evidence is a bit stronger. People who maintain close relationships, who have regular, meaningful conversations, who feel connected to others, tend to have better cognitive outcomes. And this makes sense from a neurological standpoint. Social interaction is cognitively demanding. You have to track what people are saying, interpret tone and body language, hold your own thoughts while listening to theirs, adjust your responses based on feedback, manage your emotions, read social cues. It's a full brain workout. Isolation, by contrast, reduces that demand. The brain has less to process, fewer challenges to meet, fewer reasons to stay sharp. Physical activity is another piece. And again, the evidence is mixed, but suggestive. We know that aerobic exercise increases blood flow to the brain. We know it promotes the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth and survival of neurons. We know it reduces inflammation and improves vascular health. All of that should, in theory, support cognitive function. And observational studies do show that people who stay physically active tend to have better cognitive outcomes. But we don't have definitive proof that exercise prevents dementia. We have strong hints. We have correlations. We have plausible mechanisms, but not certainty. So what do you do with that? You make a judgment call. You weigh the evidence, consider the risks and benefits, and decide what makes sense for you. For most people, staying physically active is low risk and high reward. Even if it doesn't prevent dementia, it improves cardiovascular health, reduces fall risk, supports mood, and enhances quality of life. That's enough reason to do it. The potential cognitive benefit is a bonus, not the primary justification. Let's talk about what this approach does not do. It does not reverse structural brain damage. If you have significant atrophy, if you have vascular lesions, if you have protein deposits associated with Alzheimer's disease, downshifting your nervous system and staying mentally engaged is not going to undo that. It's not going to regenerate lost neurons. It's not going to dissolve plaques. What it can do is optimize the function of the brain you have. It can reduce the noise that's making things worse. It can support the compensatory mechanisms that help you function despite underlying changes. That's not nothing. For many people, that's the difference between managing well and struggling. It also does not guarantee that you won't develop dementia. Some forms of dementia are strongly genetic. Some are driven by mechanisms we don't fully understand. Some seem almost random. You can do everything right and still get unlucky. That's hard to accept, but it's the truth. What we're talking about here is risk reduction, not risk elimination. We're talking about creating the best possible conditions for your brain to age well, knowing that we can't control every variable. And it does not mean that every memory lapse is a problem. Normal aging includes some degree of cognitive slowing. It takes longer to retrieve information. You might walk into a room and forget why you went there. You might struggle with a name that used to come easily. That's not dementia. That's the brain becoming slightly less efficient at certain tasks, especially tasks that require speed or that involve information you don't use often. The key is whether you can still function, whether you can still solve problems, whether you can still learn new things, whether you can still engage meaningfully with the world. If you can, then the occasional memory lapse is just noise. It's not a signal. Let me come back to the 5 markers I mentioned at the beginning, because I want to tie this together. Contextual recall, sequence tracking, pattern recognition, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking. These are not the only markers of healthy cognitive aging, but they're useful ones. They reflect the brain's ability to integrate information, organize time, extract regularities, manage internal states, and adapt to change. And here's the key point. All of these abilities are influenced by the state of your nervous system. If your nervous system is calm, if your sleep is good, if your inflammation is low, if your vascular health is stable, if you're socially connected, if you're mentally engaged, these abilities are more likely to stay intact. If your nervous system is chronically activated, if your sleep is poor, if your inflammation is high, if your vascular health is declining, if you're isolated, if you're mentally disengaged, these abilities are more likely to falter. So the 2-step approach I described, downshift the nervous system first, then add cognitive challenge, is really about creating the conditions where these abilities can be maintained. It's not a magic formula, it's not a guarantee, but it's a reasonable strategy based on what we know right now. I also want to say something about expectations because I think this is where a lot of frustration comes from. People expect their brains to work at 70 the way they did at 30. That's not realistic. The brain changes with age. Processing speed slows. Working memory capacity decreases slightly. Multitasking becomes harder. That's normal. It's not pathological. It's just aging. The goal is not to prevent all cognitive change. The goal is to maintain the abilities that matter most. The ability to think clearly, to solve problems, to connect with others, to live independently, to find meaning and purpose. Those things can be preserved even as other things decline. And here's something I find reassuring, even though it's not often talked about. Older adults often develop compensatory strategies that offset some of the cognitive slowing. They use external memory aids more effectively. They rely on routines to reduce cognitive load. They prioritize what matters and let go of what doesn't. They use wisdom and experience to make decisions more efficiently without needing to process every detail. That's not a failure. That's adaptation. That's the brain being smart about how to function well with the resources it has. Let me give you a practical example. Let's say you're in your mid-70s and you've noticed that you're forgetting names more often. That bothers you. You worry it's a sign of something serious. The first thing I'd want to know is, are you sleeping well? If you're waking up 3 times a night to use the bathroom, or if you're lying awake worrying about something, your brain isn't getting the deep sleep it needs to consolidate memories. Fix that first. The second thing I'd want to know is, are you socially engaged? If you're spending most of your time alone, you're not using the neural circuits that support name recall. Use it or lose it is a real thing. The third thing I'd want to know is, are you stressed? If you're dealing with chronic worry or grief or financial strain, your brain is allocating resources to threat detection, not to encoding and retrieving names. Address that. If you do all that and you're still forgetting names, then we talk about compensatory strategies. Writing things down, using photos to jog your memory, asking people to remind you, creating associations that help you remember. These are not signs of weakness. They're signs of intelligent adaptation. And for most people, that's enough. The name forgetting is annoying, but it doesn't interfere with daily life. It doesn't prevent you from having meaningful relationships or doing the things you care about. Now, if the forgetting is more pervasive, if you're forgetting entire conversations, if you're getting lost in familiar places, if you're struggling to follow instructions, if you're repeating yourself constantly without realizing it, then we'd want to do a more formal assessment, because those are different. Those suggest more significant disruption. But isolated memory lapses, especially for names or where you put your keys, are usually just normal aging amplified by poor sleep or stress or lack of use. Let's talk about breathing for a moment, because this is one of the simplest ways to downshift the nervous system, and it's almost always overlooked. When you're stressed or in pain or anxious, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. That signals to your brain that you're in danger, which activates the sympathetic nervous system, which releases adrenaline and cortisol, which further disrupts cognitive function. It's a loop. But you can interrupt that loop by deliberately slowing your breathing. Not by taking huge, deep breaths, which can actually make you feel more anxious, but by extending your exhale. Breathe in for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 6 or 7. Do that for 2 or 3 minutes. It shifts the nervous system out of fight or flight and into rest and digest. It lowers heart rate. It reduces cortisol. It clears the noise. I know that sounds too simple to matter, but it does matter. Your brain is constantly monitoring signals from your body, and your breathing is one of the loudest signals. If your breathing says danger, your brain will respond accordingly. If your breathing says safe, your brain will relax. It's not magic, it's physiology. Posture also matters in a similar way. If you're slumped forward, if your shoulders are rounded, if your chest is compressed, your breathing is restricted, and your nervous system reads that as stress. If you sit or stand with your spine relatively upright, with your chest open, your breathing improves and your nervous system calms. Again, it sounds trivial, but these small mechanical tweaks send signals that ripple through the whole system. Let me address something that comes up a lot. People ask me about supplements, about omega-3s, about B vitamins, about antioxidants, about herbal extracts. And here's the honest answer. The evidence is weak. Some studies show small benefits. Other studies show no benefit. Most of the positive studies are industry-funded and methodologically flawed. There's no supplement that has been proven, in rigorous trials, to prevent or reverse cognitive decline. That doesn't mean supplements are useless. It means the evidence is not strong enough to make confident recommendations. What I usually say is this. If you have a documented deficiency, if your B12 is low, if your vitamin D is low, then correcting that deficiency makes sense. If you're not eating much fish and you want to take an omega-3 supplement, that's probably safe and might help, though the evidence is mixed. But if you're hoping that a supplement is going to protect your brain in any dramatic way, you're likely to be disappointed. The bigger wins come from sleep, stress management, physical activity, social connection, and vascular health. Those are the foundational things. Supplements, if they help at all, are marginal. Same thing with brain training apps. The evidence is not strong. Some studies show that people get better at the specific tasks in the app, but that improvement doesn't transfer to real-world cognitive function. You get better at the game, but not at remembering where you put your keys. That said, if you enjoy the app, if it's mentally engaging and it gives you a sense of accomplishment, then there's no harm in it. Just don't expect it to prevent dementia. What seems to matter more is real-world cognitive challenge, learning something genuinely new, engaging in activities that require sustained attention and problem-solving, having conversations that challenge your thinking, reading complex material, teaching something to someone else. These are harder to package into an app, but they're probably more effective because they engage multiple cognitive systems at once. Let me say something about social connection again, because I don't think we take it seriously enough. Loneliness is not just an emotional problem. It's a physiological stressor. It activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. It increases inflammation. It disrupts sleep. It accelerates cognitive decline. And it's incredibly common in older adults. People lose spouses, friends move away or die, mobility decreases, social networks shrink, and before you know it, someone who used to have a rich social life is spending most of their time alone. This is not something you can fix with a supplement or a brain training app. It requires intentional effort. It requires reaching out, even when it feels hard. It requires building new connections when old ones are lost. It requires being willing to be vulnerable, to admit that you're lonely, to ask for help. That's not easy, but it's essential. If I had to choose one intervention that I think makes the biggest difference in cognitive aging, it would be maintaining social connection. Not because it's a magic bullet, but because it touches so many systems at once. It reduces stress. It provides cognitive stimulation. It gives you a reason to get out of bed. It creates meaning. All of that supports brain health. Let me also say something about purpose. People who have a sense of purpose, who feel that their life has meaning, that they have something to contribute, that they matter, tend to have better cognitive outcomes. This is hard to measure, and the causality is unclear. It might be that people with better cognitive function are more able to maintain a sense of purpose, or it might be that having a purpose protects the brain by reducing stress and increasing engagement. Probably both are true, but either way, it's worth thinking about. What gives your life meaning? What do you care about? What do you want to contribute, even in small ways? It doesn't have to be grand. It could be staying connected with your grandchildren. It could be volunteering at a local organization. It could be tending a garden. It could be writing letters. It could be mentoring someone. The specifics don't matter as much as the feeling that you have something to offer, that you're not just passing time, that your presence makes a difference. I realize I've been talking for a while, and I want to bring this to a close without rushing. Let me summarize what I think is most important. First, cognitive aging is variable. Some people decline rapidly. Some people stay sharp into their 90s. We can't predict with certainty who will do well and who won't. But we can identify patterns that are associated with better outcomes. Second, those patterns include contextual recall, sequence tracking, pattern recognition, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking. These are markers of a brain that's still integrating information, organizing experience, and adapting to change. Third, these abilities are influenced not just by the brain itself, but by the whole system: sleep, stress, inflammation, vascular health, social connection, mental engagement. Fourth, the most effective strategy is a two-step approach. Downshift the nervous system first, then add cognitive challenge. And fifth, this is not a guarantee. It's a way to shift the odds in your favor, knowing that some things are beyond our control. I also want to acknowledge what we don't know. We don't fully understand why some people develop dementia and others don't. We don't have a cure. We don't have a definitive prevention strategy. What we have are clues, correlations, plausible mechanisms, and practices that seem to help more often than not. That's the reality. And I think it's important to be honest about that, rather than pretending we have more certainty than we do. If you're listening to this and you're worried about your own cognitive health, here's what I'd suggest. Start with sleep. If your sleep is broken, address it. Work with a doctor if you need to, but don't accept poor sleep as inevitable. Second, look at your stress level. Are you carrying chronic worry or grief or tension? Find ways to downshift, even for a few minutes a day. Breathing exercises, gentle movement, time in nature, connection with people you trust. Third, stay socially engaged. Don't let isolation become your default. Reach out. Build new connections if old ones are lost. Fourth, stay mentally engaged. Learn something new. Challenge yourself. Don't just coast. And fifth, take care of your vascular health. Manage your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your cholesterol. Don't smoke. Stay physically active. These are not glamorous interventions. They're not exciting, but they're the foundation. And if you do all that and you still notice cognitive changes that worry you, talk to a doctor. Get a proper assessment. Don't assume the worst, but don't ignore it either. Early intervention, when it's possible, can sometimes slow progression or help you adapt more effectively. All right, I think that's where I'll leave it. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button. If you want more of these discussions, subscribe to the Everyday Health Podcast and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. And here's a question for you. What's one thing you've noticed about your own thinking or memory that you'd like to understand better? Drop it in the comments if you're comfortable sharing. I read them, and they help me think about what to cover next. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself.